stairs. So, very good, very good. We've been in the Book of Ruth this whole month. We've been tracking through the Book of Ruth, a very small book in the Old Testament, but a very important one, only 4 chapters long. It is such a small book, but very important one, very powerful. Lots of good things going on here. And the best part of Ruth is it ends, one of the best parts anyways, it ends with a happy ending, right? It has we're moving into chapter 4, and people love happy endings, right? The best stories all have happy endings to them. Cinderella, her life is terrible, and her evil stepsisters, kind of have her boxed into a corner, and she ends up, because of a glass slipper, she ends up getting to marry the handsome prince, and they live happily ever after. That's an awesome story, timeless story. Sleeping Beauty, the same way, right? She's the witch wants her put away, and so I'm trying to remember, it's been a long time since I've read Sleeping Beauty to my kids, right? She bites into a poisoned apple, I think, if I remember correctly, and she falls asleep, and finally her handsome Prince Philip, maybe, who ends up being kind of a Prince Charming, comes and kisses her and wakes her up, and she's happy, and they go off and they get married and all that good stuff. The best stories are the ones with happy endings. And maybe that's why Ruth appeals to us so much. Ruth is a book, it's a journey that begins with 3 funerals, and it ends with a wedding and a baby. And so it's just along the way, the characters face all these difficult decisions. There's lots of uncertainty. There's a whole host of challenges that we couldn't possibly grasp in the 21st century or relate to, barely. But by the time God has written the last page of Ruth's story, everything had turned out for the good. So read along with me, if you will, in your Bibles. I'm going to read from Ruth chapter 4, and it's kind of a long chapter, so I'm going to read the first few verses, and then I'm going to skip and read the last few verses as soon as I catch a drink, because I've got a cough coming. So that'll give you just a second to get to Ruth chapter 4. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend. Sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down together. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. And so I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know. For there is none other beside you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the land from Naomi, you will also require Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead and in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now it was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging, to confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. And then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. And also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his brothers, and from the gates of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Skipping to verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And then the woman of the village said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." And Naomi took the child, laid him on her lap, and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed. And he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Quite a reversal of fortune for this family, right? Quite a reversal of fortune. If you go all the way back to the very first chapter, it begins, or along the way in the first chapter, it has this amazing statement from Naomi that kind of sums it all up as she's heading out of this land of Moab and heading back to Bethlehem. She says, "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." She's really angry at God, right? And then when the story closes, these women from Bethlehem that appear in the story, it seems as if the author has made sure their words are put in here so we can kind of keep up with what's going on. The women of Bethlehem said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. For now you have this son who is worth more than 7 sons. You have Ruth, who is worth more than 7. Your daughter-in-law, Ruth, is worth more than 7 sons." The God that Naomi thought was against her, right, turns out to be the God that is for her. And so it turns out to be a beautiful story, and a beautiful story for Ruth as well. God has written this fantastic ending for them. Wouldn't it be great if all our stories turned out so well, right? Wouldn't it be great if all our stories turned out as well as Ruth? And how do we get that? How do we get a story with a happy ending like Ruth's story? Okay, so to answer that, we have to, and to look at this book, we have to teach this book, we have to helicopter up. Has anybody flown in a helicopter here? We have one person, 2 people that have flown in a helicopter. Was it a lot of fun? Cool, that's great. I'll have to ask you more, tell me more about that after the service. I have not flown in a helicopter, but we have to do what they call helicoptering up so we can get a bird's eye view. So we're going to kind of metaphorically, we're all going to climb in the helicopter, right, and fly up a little ways. And this is what they do when somebody wants to get a really good view of what's going on. A forester wants to get a good view of the forest that they're going to cut trees out of, or there's a disaster or something like that. The first thing they do is they go and they send somebody up in a helicopter, the president or somebody like that, goes and looks over the situation so they can see what's going on. And the reason is you can understand things a lot better when you're really high up, when you can grasp the big picture. So let's see what happens when we go up and we fly up in this helicopter and we look at the story of Ruth. The first really big moment in Ruth and Naomi's life comes way back in that first chapter when they made a decision intentionally to set themselves out towards Bethlehem, right? This verse 7 verses in, says, "So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah." That was a big, bold decision on Naomi's part, right? This was a week-long journey back then to get from where they were back to Bethlehem, to her homeland. That was very intentional and very brave. They didn't have any of the conveniences that we have today when you travel. You know, when our kids were little and we used to travel across the country here or there, wherever we went, or coming to Maine for vacation, right? So we come up to Maine for vacation. Diane and I knew the location of every McDonald's between home and where we were going. If we were going somewhere we hadn't been, we'd Google it and mark it out on the map, right? So we had these spots. And we knew that because when the kids got rambunctious, we'd pull into the nearest McDonald's and we'd toss them into the ball pit, right? And you could just toss them into the ball pit. And that meant that we could sit down and have a wonderful meal together, even if it's just a Big Mac and an order of fries, right? And all we had to do was just look over now and then, sit outside the ball pit and look over, and Diane would say, "I see a foot." And it's like, okay, good, we can order the hot apple pie, right? You knew you had time for that. It was a good sign. Travel's really easy in these days. It was not in their day, especially for two women who were on the road alone. Thieves, robbers, storms, all kinds of stuff. Walking through the desert wilderness, no houses, no stores, no 7-Eleven, no McDonald's. This was a big decision they made, and this is an important decision. It's important because new life begins when we set our faces towards God, right? New life starts for us when we start turning our faces towards God. Naomi and Ruth, they took a huge chance by moving their lives towards God, and God met them with abundance. Hundreds of years later, a young priest, if you will, a young rabbi, I should say, who also came from Bethlehem, would say to his followers, he would say, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you." Jesus wants us to know, right? That when we turn our lives towards Him, and we set our face towards Him and move in His direction, amazing things happen. New life begins when we turn our face towards God. That's the way it works. That's probably the whole first 2 or 3 chapters, right? In fact, just about everything in the book is based on that idea, that new life begins when you turn your face towards God. And when you make a decision for God's will to be prime in your life instead of your will, good things happen. For Ruth and her mother-in-law, that thing is a fellow by the name of Boaz. And my Boaz, the fellow Paul who came up and played Boaz last week, and I was thinking, we were doing that radio play last week, I was looking at Paul up here, and he just makes a good Boaz, right? When you look at Paul, big guy, kind of tall, big shoulders and the whole thing, sturdy sort of fellow, not the kind of guy you'd want to tussle with, right? Paul would make a great bouncer. He really would. Don't tell him I said that. But he looks like a Boaz to me, and I saw him up there, right? Boaz is the thing that happened when they turned their life towards God. That Boaz came along. You could say that God provided Boaz, put Boaz in their place. And so Boaz has been having this he starts having this thing for Ruth, and he moving closer and closer and closer to her. And we talked about the threshing floor, and we talked about uncovering Boaz's feet and all that stuff. Now, remember, we're still up here at 1,000 feet, right? We're still way up high. And so Boaz shows up. That's why you have to have the big guy like Paul to be Boaz. We can see him from way high up. So Boaz is this big guy that we can see, a big part of the story. God has put them there in his life. And Boaz plays the part of Redeemer. And we don't want to miss the value of redemption, because redemption is really what it's all about. If you had to sum up this story of Ruth in one word, you would say redemption. Say redemption. Redemption. Boaz, we can see him way down there from our helicopter. And he goes up to the city gates and he pulls together these 10 witnesses and he does the work of redemption, and the other guy doesn't want, and so he pulls off his shoe, pulls off his sandal, and hands it over. We can't go into all that. We just don't have the time. I can tell you, I read somewhere that if a woman was spurned by her husband in the Old Testament, she would take off his sandals and spit on him in public. So that's kind of an interesting thing to do, but that's kind of but it was also a thing where when you took off your shoe and you handed it, it was kind of like a handshake. It's the equivalent of our handshake today, right? Back in the day. So we've got this one redeemer who says he'll do it, and then a kinsman, and then he says he backs out of the deal, and Boaz is pretty happy about that, right? But we can't get into all the details because we're flying too high. I can't explain why Boaz had to have 10 witnesses instead of 3, and I can't give you the whole story of taking off your shoe to close a bargain. But if we flew down a little bit and got a little closer down, what we might be able to see is this abandoned field where Naomi and Elimelech used to live. Remember, all the way back in the beginning of the story, it starts with a journey with Naomi and Elimelech and their 2 sons, right? And they journey to this foreign land. They kind of leave God's space and they go to another space. They leave their farm behind, because that's what you did back in those days when there was a famine. You just went wherever you could find food. And so they've left their farm behind. And so if we went down just a little bit, we might see this old farmhouse and this field that hasn't been touched in a dozen years, right? It's all overgrown now, right? A field that Naomi and Elimelech used to own, and by rights, Naomi still owns this field and this farmhouse. And if we got really close, we got down really low with the helicopter, we might be able to see that in this century and in Jesus' time as well, widows without male heirs were in danger of losing their land to unscrupulous people. People who were power hungry and money hungry and stuff. They would go and they would bribe a judge, give him a few shekels or silver coins, and they would take that land from the widows. And that helped me when I read this story, because I never knew what this meant when Jesus said, "Beware of the scribes who devour widows' houses and make a pretense of long prayers." You see, that's what they would do. Even some of the priests were on the take, and they would comfort and console the poor widow who had lost her husband and all that stuff. And then they would say, "You really don't need that farmland, do you? Sell it to me for a really cheap price." And they would line their own pockets and flip the farmland over and sell it and make a huge profit. So that's what it means when Jesus says, "Beware the people who devour people's houses," the priests who devour people's houses. But we don't need to get that close to the story. What we really need to do is to know what it means to be redeemed. What does it mean to be redeemed? Redeemed is a very simple word. It means to recover ownership by paying a price. You guys are all redeemers. You've all redeemed something once or twice in your life, right? Anybody here drive a car? I do, right? Did you go and pay cash for that car? Maybe some of you did, right? Probably most of you went to the bank and signed a whole bunch of papers and got a loan. You put a couple $1,000s down, and the car was $20,000 or $25,000, and you set the rest off in a loan that you had to pay off over 4, 5, or 6 years, right? Why do you make payments to the bank? Because you're redeeming the title back from the bank. The bank has the title, and you're going to redeem it. To redeem something is to recover ownership by paying a price, a predetermined, specified price. In Ruth's day, a redeemer had to have 3 qualities. You had to be related, right? You had to be related in some way. The law said if you weren't related, right? If you weren't related to somebody, you couldn't redeem somebody's land. You would be considered a thief. You had to have some relation to the person. A redeemer had to have the will, right? You had to want the widow and her land. That's true today, by the way. To redeem something, you have to have a will. You have to have a desire. You have to want it. If you were showing houses, right, and maybe you're looking to buy a new house, right? I have some friends in the back row who just bought a new house. They've been looking for quite a while, a couple of years now, to find a house up here in Maine, right? And you're looking to buy a new house, and the real estate agent takes you around, and he pulls you up, and he shows you this beauty, right? And you take one look at it, and you say, I'm not going to buy that house. Why not? Because you don't have the reason, the will, the desire to have that house. A redeemer has to have the desire to redeem. And finally, a redeemer has to have the funds to do it, right? You have to have the funds to be able to redeem something. It's fun to think of buying all this stuff, the big boat shows going on here in Portland, and you can go in and check out all the huge boats they've got for sale. It's fantastic. All kinds of stuff going on there right now. Some of those boats are pretty expensive. It's fun to dream about something, but it's a different thing to pay for it. When I was 16, I had just got my license, and I was driving down the road one day to Castleton, Vermont, this little town between Rutland and Pulteney, which are both little towns, actually. But this little town, and I was driving down the road on Route 4A, and I looked off and on the side, and somebody had just parked this, not brand new, but at that time it was 8, 9, 10 years old, right? 8 years old or so, parked this beautiful car in their front driveway and had a big red for sale sign in the window. 1971 Plymouth Fury Sport. And I screeched the brakes to a stop on my little Plymouth Valiant that I owned, which is like a grandma's car, even back then, right? But it was all I had. I screeched the brakes to a stop, and I got out and I looked it over. Power windows and power brakes and tinted glass and 440 V8 and 140 mile an hour speedometer, and I was pretty sure it could get pretty close to that if you had a long enough piece of road and stuff. And so I went home because I didn't have the money, and I asked my dad, I said, can you help me buy that? And he said, no. My parents had this thing when I was 16. They wanted to see me live to 17. So it was a thing. So he said, no, you can't buy that car. You can't have that car. So I didn't have the funds to buy it. And it went to something else. You see, if you're going to redeem something, you have to be able to pay the price to do it. Boaz had all 3 of those things. He makes the deal. He has the desire. He's a distant relation of the family, and he has the money to take on this property, and he marries Ruth, and he adopts Naomi into his family, and Ruth and Boaz do what newlyweds have done since the beginning of time, right? 9 months later, there's this little baby boy, Obed, who becomes the great-great-great-grandfather of King David, who becomes the great-great-great-grandfather of Joseph, stepfather of our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. You see, to bring Ruth to a happy ending, God had to provide someone who could redeem her from everything that had happened. And in Christ, God provides a redeemer for us. And Jesus meets all those specifications, all those qualifications, right? He's related to us, 10 fingers, 10 toes, right? He's not a bright cloud in the sky or something like that. He walks with his disciples. He gets hungry with them. He eats with them. You know, we go swimming, we can imagine, all kinds of things like that. He had good days and bad days, just like his disciples. Jesus was related to us. He had the desire to redeem us, for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. Jesus' mission statement right there. The church is pretty much as well, actually. He has a desire, and most of all, he had the funds. Because what's more valuable than the blood of a God? Seriously? What's more valuable than the blood of God's Son? We're going to take communion in a few minutes. We're going to celebrate this meal that represents the broken body and the blood of Jesus Christ. How do you redeem people from sin? How do you redeem people? You go back into the Old Testament, and God said, here's these 10 commandments, and if you follow all these, we're good to go. But the penalty for breaking any one of the 10 commandments is death. That was it. That was just how it was. Eternal separation from God. Not like dead, like zap, right? But it was eternal separation from God. How do you fix that? Well, you could have a God who dies in your place. You could have a God who redeems you through his death and his blood, which is pretty much the only possible thing that could ever pay off that debt, to bring us back into the family. You see, just as Boaz and Ruth have this really happy ending because Boaz redeemed Ruth and Naomi and her family, and they have a baby, and it all becomes it's storybook ending, I'll tell you. Just as Boaz redeemed them, Jesus comes to earth in a little town called Bethlehem. If the hairs in your neck aren't standing up, right? In a same little town where God provides a redeemer for Ruth and Naomi, God provides a baby to redeem all of the human race. All of us. Anyone who will trust in him. A life of trouble changed to a life of joy thanks to a Redeemer that God had provided. You see, if we want a happy ending to our story, it's not just about investing in that retirement 401k or saving up for your nest egg for a rainy day or buying a second house in Florida or whatever it might be. Those are all good things. I hope you get all of those. And I hope you invite me along to Florida because I'm tired of snow, right? I'll take an invitation to anybody's house in Florida right now. Seriously, ask me after the service, right? Those are all good things. But the real journey to a happy ending is a journey that points its way to our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. May your journey be a good one. May your days be filled with joy. And may you find yourself redeemed by the only one who can. Amen.